Tonight, we drift back to a world that smelled of sweat, rot, and burning tallow. A world where the night was quiet. Not because it was peaceful, but because most people were too exhausted to make a sound. You are in a village. A real one. Not the storybook kind. One with dung in the streets, damp straw on your floor, and a constant dull ache in your back. You're not rich. You're not powerful. You're just alive. And that's already something. But even being alive could feel like a curse. So what did people do when they needed to escape? When they needed to feel something different? Or nothing at all? They reached for whatever they could find. And that's where the story begins. Not with kings or crusaders, but with the ordinary folk, searching for a way to get out of their heads. In the Middle Ages, there were no movies, no podcasts, no social media to numb the mind, no quick hit of dopamine from a screen. Life was linear. You woke up with the chickens, you went to bed with the dark. And between sunrise and sleep, you worked, you worried, and if you were lucky, you forgot your pain long enough to smile. That kind of life doesn't leave much room for joy, but it leaves plenty of room for escape. That's why getting high, though they wouldn't have called it that, wasn't a rare thing. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. You just had to know where to look. For most people, the easiest escape was already in their cup. Ale. Not the hoppy golden drink we know today. Medieval ale was dark, thick, and cloudy. It was more like fermented bread soup than a beverage. But it did the job. Oh, did it ever. The alcohol content varied wildly. Sometimes it was weak. Other times, it could knock a man flat on his face before sunset. It wasn't just about fun. It was about forgetting. The ache of your knees. The hunger in your belly. The beating your brother took from the reeve for stealing a turnip. 2 cups of strong ale, and suddenly, none of it mattered. Children drank it too. Not because anyone wanted them to start young, but because clean water was often more dangerous than beer. But drink wasn't enough for everyone. Some needed more darkness, more light, more something. They turned to herbs, and not the kind you find in soup. Belladonna, henbane, mandrake. To you, they're names in old apothecary books. To them, they were doors. Belladonna, known as deadly nightshade, could cause hallucinations so vivid, you'd swear you'd spoken with the Virgin Mary or the devil himself. It widened your pupils, made you dizzy, slowed your heartbeat. Some said it made witches fly. Others said it dragged souls into the abyss. These herbs were sometimes used in flying ointments by so-called witches, applied not by mouth, but by smearing them onto certain areas of the body. Places where the skin was thin and the blood vessels close. You can imagine where. The church noticed. It noticed when women in the woods began speaking in tongues. When hermits claimed to see angels. When townsfolk gathered to dance in circles all night under the full moon. Was it heresy? Was it madness? Or was it something they had taken? Inquisition records, dusty and paranoid, are filled with whispers of women who flew, men who wept with joy after eating a strange root, and monks who claimed they had glimpsed heaven after a simple herbal tea. They weren't lying. They just went somewhere else. And the church didn't like that. Because if peasants could touch the divine without a priest, what was the point of obedience? You might think getting high was just about pleasure. But for most people in the medieval world, it wasn't about fun. It was about survival. About leaving behind the screaming pain of a rotted tooth. The grief of losing a child. The hopelessness of knowing that winter might kill your family and there's nothing you can do about it. So you drink, you chew on a root, you eat a mushroom that makes the trees look like they're dancing. And for a moment, your mind lifts, just a little. You're still poor, you're still dirty. But in your mind, you're somewhere else. Because while modern minds might ask, why would you ever put that in your body? A medieval peasant might answer, because the world is already poison. Might as well choose my own. The deeper you sink into the lives of medieval folk, the clearer it becomes. People weren't trying to get high for entertainment. They were trying to disappear. Disappear from the burden of being alive in a world that didn't care if you made it through the night. Disappear from the cold, from hunger, from the ache of knees and backs bent too long over fields. They craved forgetfulness more than pleasure. And for some, that escape wasn't just in ale or herbs. It was in ritual. In villages and towns, church bells rang constantly, not just for worship, but for control. Monks chanted to the point of exhaustion. Incense filled the air, sometimes so thick that parishioners would pass out in pews. Was it piety or something more? Many historians believe that certain incense mixtures used in medieval churches contained psychoactive resins, like frankincense and myrrh. Not just for smell, but for inducing calm, euphoria, or even visions during long ceremonies. Imagine sitting in a candlelit chapel, your stomach empty, the air thick with smoke, Latin echoing in rhythms you don't understand. And suddenly, you feel something shift. Some called it the Holy Spirit. Others, perhaps, were just floating. There are documented cases of hermits and mystics who would retreat into the forest, living on nothing but herbs, roots, and rainwater. Some would emerge weeks later, half-starved, wide-eyed, and shaking, claiming they had spoken to angels, or battled demons, or received visions of the end times. One such root? Mandrake. To dig up a mandrake without proper rituals was said to bring death. Why? Because the root looks like a twisted human body, and when torn from the ground, it was said to scream. In truth, mandrake contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, both of which can cause hallucinations, disorientation, and even unconsciousness. In small amounts, a trance. In large ones, madness or death. The legends weren't fiction. They were science without understanding. Not everyone who got high did so by accident or for worship. Some learned the art. In quiet corners of medieval Europe, especially in places like Germany, Italy, and France, midwives and wise women were known to keep secret gardens. Plots filled with herbs most people feared to touch. These women knew how to mix belladonna with fat, or brew henbane into sleep teas. They used them for childbirth pain, for love potions, and yes, for flying dreams. Records from witch trials often mention the same thing again and again: the ointment, a thick, dark paste smeared onto the body, often on hidden places, to induce visions of flying through the night. Modern pharmacologists have recreated these pastes using trial formulas found in 15th century grimoires. The result? Out-of-body experiences, time loss, complete immersion in hallucination. These women weren't charlatans. They were pharmacists of the shadows. A monk writes in his journal, "A brother consumed the dried mushroom by mistake. He lay in the garden for 6 hours. When he awoke, he claimed he had danced with saints and that the Virgin had sung him a lullaby." The mushroom? Likely Amanita muscaria, the red-capped fungus of fairy tales. Beautiful, deadly, enigmatic. It doesn't kill easily, but it does change the brain. Modern users report time distortion, intense euphoria, and surreal dreamlike states. In the medieval world, there was no psychedelic culture. There was only danger and reverence. If something made your soul leave your body, it was either God or the devil. Let's not pretend that getting high was safe. Many who sought escape never came back. The line between vision and poison was razor thin. One wrong route, one wrong dose, one moment of desperation, and the mind would snap. They called it divine punishment. They said she went mad from sin. But behind the veil of judgment was often a simple truth. Someone was hurting. Someone tried to forget. And something went wrong. Still, they kept reaching. Because even if the cost was madness, even if they risked hell, the moment of freedom was worth it. Floating outside your pain, seeing colors in the sky when everything else was gray, touching something, anything that felt bigger than the dirt under your nails and the sweat on your back. Getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a trend. It was a rebellion. A whispered, desperate no against the crushing weight of reality. Forget the broomsticks. Forget the black hats. The real witches of medieval Europe weren't cackling under the moon. They were crouched over boiling pots, pressing roots into pastes and whispering to plants as though they were old friends. Because in many ways, they were. Thus were the women, sometimes men, who understood what grew in the hedgerows. Who knew which root made you sleep, which one made you scream, and which one sent your soul drifting into the clouds? They weren't magicians. They were chemists of the subconscious. And their brews? They weren't just tales. They worked. Imagine a one-room cottage at the edge of the village. Thick bundles of herbs hang from the ceiling beams, some fragrant, others strangely pungent. A blackened kettle simmers over an open fire, the bubbling contents giving off wisps of steam that sting your eyes. In a corner, a leather-bound book lies open. Not a spell book with glowing runes, but a diary of doses. A little too much henbane, vomiting, too much mandrake, seizures, just enough belladonna, visions. These women measured in pinches, in finger widths, in breath counts. Their knowledge wasn't written, it was passed by whispers. And often, it was a matter of life and death. Many witch trial documents refer again and again to flying ointments, mixtures made from animal fat and infused with psychoactive herbs, applied not to the mouth, but to the skin, often in intimate areas where absorption was fastest. It sounds absurd, but modern experiments have confirmed the effect. One such recreated recipe includes belladonna, deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake root, datura, animal fat to create the balm. The result, applied topically, loss of coordination, out-of-body sensations, intense hallucinations, a feeling of weightlessness. In the minds of villagers and inquisitors, that weightlessness became flight. The witches weren't lying. They felt like they flew. And in a world where women were forbidden to be free, flying, real or not, was rebellion. The image of a witch stirring a bubbling cauldron wasn't just folklore. It was medicine. It was escape. It was power. Some recipes were designed to ease childbirth pain. Others were made to help the dying drift into death without agony. Still others were for love, for lust, for madness. Here's one recorded potion from a 14th century herbal. Steep the root of henbane and the bark of yew. Add wine and heat until steam rises. Let the one who drinks fall into sleep, and in dreams he shall speak with spirits. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Some slept for days, some never woke up. To the outside world, she was dangerous. A woman who didn't marry, who lived alone, who knew what the village priest didn't, People said she could hex a cow with a glance, that she danced with demons, that her breath could kill a man. But often, she was simply someone who knew more than she was supposed to. And her brews? They weren't curses. They were doors. Knowledge was dangerous in the medieval world, especially if you were poor, or a woman, or both. And so these herbalists, these witches, often walked a razor's edge. One too many whispers from a jealous neighbor, and the brew that eased pain became the reason for torture. But still, they brewed, because people needed them, not just for healing, but for escaping, for tasting something beyond the filth and fear of daily life. Their brews offered visions, dreams, and sometimes, if the dose was just right, a feeling of touching the divine. In Part 2, we'll enter the blurred realm of ritual hallucination, where monks, mystics, and peasants alike cross the line between faith and madness, using sacred herbs and prayers not to worship, but to transcend. Because sometimes, getting high wasn't witchcraft. It was holy. The line between prayer and poison was thin in the Middle Ages. A monk could spend hours on his knees in silent devotion, eyes closed, breath steady, body still, and emerge claiming to have spoken with saints. Was it divine connection? Or was it something in the incense? Few people today realize how intense medieval church services could be. They weren't quiet affairs. They were immersive, sensory experiences designed to move the soul. The chanting was hypnotic. Gregorian modes looped endlessly, their strange harmonies lulling even the skeptical into trances. The incense, made from frankincense, myrrh, benzoin, and other resinous substances, filled the air so thick you could taste it. These weren't just nice smells. Frankincense and myrrh have psychoactive properties. Mild, yes, but real. When burned in high concentration in a poorly ventilated stone chapel, they could cause lightheadedness, euphoria, and even spiritual hallucinations. To a starving, fasting monk in the 12th hour of prayer, the effect could feel supernatural. And perhaps that was the point. One of the most fascinating figures of medieval Europe was Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and composer. Hildegard claimed to receive divine visions from an early age. Visions filled with cosmic wheels, fire, and angels with eyes in their wings. She described light pouring into her soul and said it made her see the secret structures of heaven. Modern historians believe Hildegard may have suffered from migraines or temporal lobe epilepsy. But there's another possibility. She may have used herbal infusions, common in convent gardens, to induce altered states. Records from her abbey suggest knowledge of plants like vervain, for clarity of thought, mugwort used for vivid dreams, wormwood, which in high doses can be a hallucinogen, valerian, which induces deep, vivid sleep. Did Hildegard brew her visions? We may never know. But the line between spiritual revelation and altered consciousness is very, very thin. Another quiet corner of medieval intoxication lies with the pilgrims. Wandering across hundreds of miles to reach sacred shrines, pilgrims often suffered blisters, infections, and worse. Some turned to pain remedies, and in certain regions, especially the Mediterranean, one of those remedies was opium poppy. Mixed with wine or ground into a poultice, papaver somniferum dulled the pain and opened the door to dreams. It was called the sleep flower, and sleep it gave, sometimes too deeply. Some pilgrims experienced floating sensations. Others described visions of saints or the Virgin Mary smiling from fields of white petals. It wasn't always divine. It was often chemical. But in their minds, the two were the same. The church walked a strange tightrope. It condemned witches for their potions, while offering wine that became blood and smoke that brought visions. Why? Because control matters. When they offered the vision, it was called grace. When a woman in the woods did it, it was heresy. But deep down, both paths walked the same trail, one paved in ritual, the other in roots. Medieval physicians were not immune to the call of altered states. To study madness, some experimented on themselves, ingesting small amounts of datura, mandrake, or even aconite. They documented fever dreams, out-of-body sensations, and terrifying episodes where they believed they were being dragged to hell. These weren't recreational users. They were seekers of knowledge. And they paid the price. Some never recovered. Others became revered as mystics. One doctor, writing in 1384, said, "There are herbs that bring the mind to such a high tower that the stars speak plainly to it." Was he mad? Or just elevated? The people of the Middle Ages believed the natural world was alive with spirit. Trees whispered, rivers remembered, and herbs. Well, herbs could do anything. They could kill, they could heal, they could open the door between this world and the next. To get high in the Middle Ages wasn't just an act of pleasure or escape. It was often a ritual, a conversation, a test of trust between human and herb. Sometimes it ended in bliss, sometimes in fire. But always, it reminded people of one thing, that even in the mud, the sweat, and the sorrow, the mind could still fly. They didn't call it getting high. They called it being touched by the divine. In the shadowed corners of stone monasteries, in candlelit chapels and wind-whipped hermit caves, medieval men and women sought something more than survival. They wanted transcendence, not escape from their bodies, but elevation of their souls. And sometimes, they got there through means no holier than a handful of crushed herbs, a few days of fasting, or a strange brew poured by trembling hands into wooden cups. The pursuit of spiritual madness wasn't limited to witches or peasants. It thrived in the highest towers of religion. A monk might enter the chapel at midnight, barefoot on cold stone, and begin his vigil. Hours passed. The chants echoed off the arches above him, low and pulsing like a heartbeat. The smoke of incense curled around his face. His belly was empty. His eyes were dry. His knees screamed with stiffness. And then, something shifted. He said he saw light pour through the walls. He claimed the saints spoke. He wept, trembling as the Virgin extended her hand through flame. To him, it was not illusion. It was grace. But what truly happened in those visions? Were they miracles? Were they hallucinations brought on by deprivation and chemical haze? The answer, in many cases, is both. To feel holy was often to feel strange. Some mystics reported sensations of weightlessness, heat spreading through their chest, or hearing voices that weren't there. They interpreted these as the presence of God or the whispers of angels. But modern minds might call them something else. The tools of devotion and the tools of altered consciousness overlapped. The church, knowingly or not, crafted environments perfect for dissociation. Dim lighting, repetitive chanting, fasting, isolation, and sometimes even strange concoctions administered in the name of healing or ritual. Pilgrims who journeyed for weeks under blistering sun or bone-cracking cold would arrive at sacred sites on the verge of collapse. Their bodies were wrecked, their minds frayed. When they kissed a relic or lay beneath a statue, they often claimed visions. Blinding lights, voices, or physical ecstasy. In those moments, nothing else existed. Some lay shaking on the ground for hours. Others laughed or screamed uncontrollably. Some reported flying. Others believed they had died and returned. Many of these moments were recorded with reverence. They became the legends of saints and martyrs. They were written into illuminated manuscripts, painted on cathedral walls, and passed from lips to ears for generations. But beneath the glow of sanctity was something more human. A body pushed past its limits, a mind deprived of grounding, and sometimes, though not always, a trace of something ingested or inhaled. In some monasteries, medicinal herbs were cultivated with great care. Monks were expected to tend to the sick and the dying, and in doing so, they became experts in plants. They grew poppies for pain relief, valerian for sleep, and wormwood for stomach complaints. They brewed teas, tinctures, and oils. And it didn't take much for a dose meant to soothe to become a door to somewhere else. There were reports of monks who claimed to converse with the dead after taking sleep draughts. Nuns who saw visions of heaven after herbal remedies. Hermits who wandered into the woods and returned days later, starved and shivering, whispering of fire-eyed creatures and voices in the air. They weren't always seen as mad. Sometimes they were canonized. Even Hildegard of Bingen, now a saint, described visions so intense and surreal they might sound like the notes of a psychedelic trip. She wrote of burning skies, spinning cosmic wheels, and choirs of light. She believed these to be messages from God. Perhaps they were, but we cannot ignore the human body's response to extreme ritual, strange plants, and emotional devotion. In that fragile space between belief and biology, something extraordinary happens. It always has. And in the Middle Ages, they didn't analyze it. They embraced it. Faith was not clean. It was messy. It was loud and raw and full of trembling. To touch the divine was to risk madness. To risk madness was to open the door to something beyond human. They feared it. They sought it. And sometimes they never came back. The line between sanctity and madness was never clear in the medieval world. In fact, for many, they were one and the same. A woman who starved herself until she trembled and collapsed on the floor of the cathedral might be called blessed. If she claimed she saw angels during her convulsions, the priest might nod with solemn admiration. She would be fed broth, prayed over, and perhaps revered. Her visions would be recorded, her tears preserved as sacred. But not every ecstatic state came from prayer alone. In the silence of cloistered gardens, herbs grew with whispered intent. The sisters of many convents knew what to brew for nightmares and fevers. They knew which leaves brought sleep and which flowers made a grieving heart feel just a little lighter. Some of these nuns, especially in the warmer climates, used infusions of poppy or mugwort, not to become intoxicated, but to deepen their nightly visions, to open the heart to God. That was the justification. And maybe, in their minds, it was true. They weren't escaping the world. They were trying to transcend it. Some of the most celebrated mystics wrote detailed descriptions of their visions. What they saw was not always beautiful. There were burning wheels, mouths of light, towers of flesh. One monk claimed he saw Christ's ribs open like a door, and inside was a sky full of stars. He collapsed after that vision, foaming at the mouth. They said it was holiness, and perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was an accidental overdose of wormwood mixed with fasting and exhaustion. But none of them were seeking pleasure. Their highs were not the ecstatic dances of witches, nor the drunken laughter of villagers. Their highs were raw, sacred. They tore at the soul. The purpose wasn't to float. It was to be stripped bare before the divine. When you were seen by God, they said, it felt like burning. In some monastic texts, there are reports of brothers who willingly locked themselves away for days. No food, little water, only chanting. One by one, they entered states of delirium. They claimed to see visions not with their eyes, but through their bones. And always, the pain came first. They believed that only suffering could unlock truth, that only by breaking the body could the soul escape. These beliefs weren't confined to monasteries. In rural parishes, villagers sometimes enacted what they called ritual repentance, where men and women would march barefoot through the streets at night, flogging themselves, singing hymns until they collapsed. Some said they heard the voice of the Lord calling their name. Others said nothing. They just wept. There is one account from 1312 of a widow in southern France who refused to eat or speak for 40 days. On the final night, she screamed so loud that her neighbors broke down her door. She was curled in the corner, eyes wide, whispering a language no one understood. The priest declared it divine tongues. He ordered the floor be scrubbed with holy water and declared the house blessed. What caused her to break like that? No one asked. The medieval world did not seek medical explanations for ecstasy. It sought meaning. And when it found it, even in madness, it praised it. Even the architecture was designed to elevate the mind. The ceiling soared upward, pulling the gaze to heaven. The stained glass burned with colored light. Organs thundered, incense thickened the air, and the rituals pulsed with ancient repetition. People didn't just attend church, they surrendered to it. In that surrender, many found altered states, whether by divine hand or human biology. Some would kneel and rise again the same. Others would never be the same. The high was never just chemical. It was emotional, spiritual, ritualistic. And no one could ever tell where the vision ended and the person began. To be touched by the divine in the Middle Ages was to accept a kind of madness. To speak to God was to hear voices. To see heaven was to close your eyes and risk never opening them again the same. In this way, the sacred high was the most dangerous of all. It didn't offer an escape. It offered a glimpse. And once you saw it, you never forgot. Some sought that glimpse their whole lives. Others spent the rest of theirs trying to forget. In a world without anesthesia, antidepressants, or even the idea of comfort, there was always one thing you could count on to help you forget: drink. For the medieval poor, life was a cycle of hunger, cold, back-breaking labor, and fleeting moments of laughter stolen between storms. But when the chores were done and the animals fed, there was one refuge waiting: the alehouse. You could smell it before you saw it: yeast and smoke and sweat. The sound of clinking cups, a lute badly tuned, and voices raised, not in anger, but in defiance of silence. The door creaked open, and inside was a world warmer than your cottage, louder than your prayers, and faster than your thoughts. No one drank to savor the flavors. They drank to soften the sharpness of reality. All was not optional. For many, it was the safest drink around. Water could carry disease, especially in towns with open gutters and livestock running through the streets. Ale, with its mild alcohol content, was boiled, brewed, and, most importantly, clean. Even children drank it. But there were levels. There was small ale, barely alcoholic, just enough to be safe. Then there were the stronger brews, thick, cloudy, and inconsistent. One mug might leave you sleepy, another might drop you flat before you reached the bench. Brewed by women in kitchens and sold in front rooms, ale was both business and survival. Alewives wore striped hoods and hung a broom or greenery outside their homes to let passers-by know, ale's ready. And once you were inside, you weren't in someone's home anymore. You were in a place where the rules bent. Peasants could mock lords in hushed tones, songs could be bawdy, stories exaggerated, hopes confessed. The alehouse was part confessional, part theater, part fog. It was also a window into the darker side of escape. Drink offered something no sermon could. Forgetfulness. It dulled pain. It turned starvation into a shared joke. It made grief tolerable and failure a little funnier. But it came at a cost. There are court records from across England, France, and the Low Countries describing arguments turned violent, games ending in blood, and hangovers so fierce they were believed to be spiritual punishment. People didn't always stop with ale. Mead, cider, and wine, though less available to the poor, also made their way into cups when possible. And when someone truly wanted to lose themselves, they turned to strong ale, brewed thick with sugars, spices, and sometimes strange herbs. Some recipes included additions like juniper, wormwood, or even roasted poppy seeds. These weren't standardized brews. Each batch was different, each cup a gamble. And sometimes, that gamble turned a night of laughter into one of confusion, dreams, or a sleep that lasted longer than expected. There's a tavern record from 1378 in Norwich that tells of 3 laborers who drank fortified ale from a new brewer in town. 2 woke up in the dirt outside. The third didn't wake up at all. The local priest called it a curse. The brewer fled. But those who stayed behind didn't stop drinking. They couldn't. Because the alehouse wasn't just a place, it was a ritual. It was the only moment in a life of servitude when you could sit without being scolded, laugh without consequence, slur your fears into the air and let someone nod, drunkenly in return. Men and women alike found comfort in it. And sometimes more than comfort. Some alehouses served as secret meeting points, for love or rebellion, or just a place to breathe without the weight of being seen. And as the candlelight flickered and the mugs emptied, the night softened around the edges. The fire cracked. The voices grew hoarse. Someone began humming an old tune no one remembered learning. Another began to cry, though no one asked why. The alehouse was not a cure, but it was something. A break in the wait, a blur in the suffering. A place where reality could melt just long enough for you to remember what it felt like to smile. As the fire burned low and the alehouse settled into the late hours, something changed in the room. The laughter faded into murmurs. The shadows grew longer. People didn't talk as much as hum or sigh or stare into the bottom of their cups. In those quiet moments, drink did its most powerful work, not as a source of joy, but as a kind of forgetting. There's an old phrase from a 14th century Yorkshire ballad: "Ale smooths the soul and steals the sorrow." That was its magic. It didn't solve anything. It simply made the sharpness of life dull enough to sleep. And sleep was a gift not everyone found easily. Nightmares haunted the poor. The cries of sick children, the groans of wounded husbands, the scratch of rats behind the walls. These were not distant fears. They were nightly visitors. So if a mug of ale could silence them, even for a few hours, it was worth the coin. Even if that coin meant skipping bread the next day. In the countryside, where alehouses were few and scattered, people brewed their own. Each family had its recipe. Some used barley, others rye or oats. Some added herbs, not for flavor, but for effect. A handful of mugwort, a few crushed juniper berries, a dried root or two. Old folk tricks to deepen the sleep, to make the tongue heavy, the mind slow. Not everyone who drank did so in company. Some drank alone, quietly, routinely. There's a story from an old village near Bruges, where a widow in her 60s kept a single jug beside her bed. Every night, she poured a cup, lit a candle, and whispered to it. When she died, the jug was still warm. People said she had been talking to her husband. Maybe that was true, or maybe she just needed one small ritual that made the silence less unbearable. The church did not look kindly on drunkenness. Priests warned against it from the pulpit. They called it a gateway to sin, a cousin of sloth and lust and violence. They weren't entirely wrong. There were fights. There were regrets. There were nights that ended in ditches. But the church rarely asked why people drank. It only judged that they did. For many, ale wasn't a vice. It was a necessity, a medicine for the unmedicated, a warmth in a world of wet boots and cold hands, a hush in the roaring panic of a peasant's life. Even lords and clergy weren't immune. In monasteries where sobriety was preached, wine flowed freely on feast days. Some monks brewed their own strong drink in silence, labeling it for healing purposes. But not all the bottles stayed in the infirmary. A few documents survived describing disputes between brothers who drank too much, sang too loudly, and were found sleeping under altar cloths. Their punishments were mild. A week of extra silence, an evening without supper, nothing that truly stopped the habit. Because everyone, even the pious, needed to escape. And the cup made it easy. For those who had lost something, children, land, health, the cup dulled the ache. For those with nothing to begin with, it gave a glimpse of something like peace. In a world where the sky itself often felt like it was falling, the brew in your hand could lift you just high enough to forget gravity. And perhaps that was the most human act of all. To raise a mug in spite of everything and drink not to remember, but to forget. To laugh into the dark. To close your eyes before sleep and feel, even briefly, that you were safe. There were plants in the medieval world that were feared more than wolves, more than swords, more than devils. They were small, quiet. They grew in ditches and hedgerows, hidden among harmless weeds. But if you knew their names, if you truly knew them, you also knew what they could do. You knew they whispered. The people of the Middle Ages didn't separate medicine from magic. To touch a root was to call upon its spirit. To chew a leaf was to risk your soul. And yet, they did it anyway. Not recklessly, but reverently. Because in those roots and blossoms was something rare. Power. The mandrake was perhaps the most famous. Shaped like a human, it was believed to scream when pulled from the earth. That scream, they said, could drive a man mad or strike him dead where he stood. So if you needed one, you didn't just dig it up. You followed ritual. Tie the root to a black dog, walk backward at midnight, plug your ears, let the dog pull, let the plant scream. No one really knows if anyone did that. But the fear was real. Underneath the superstition was a truth. The mandrake contains alkaloids that affect the central nervous system. In small doses, it calms. In larger ones, it causes delirium, hallucinations, convulsions, sometimes death. But in the middle of all that, a window opens. People who used mandrake in tinctures or poultices reported visions, twisting landscapes, speaking animals, glowing saints. Their bodies remained still, but their minds wandered. The same was true for poppy, the sleep flower. Its red petals were pretty, its seeds harmless in bread. But the white sap drawn from its pods held something darker. Opium, a thick, bitter extract that dulled pain and blurred thought. Doctors used it to treat everything from coughs to amputations. Mothers used it to quiet their infants. And some used it on themselves, to silence grief. In a small monastery in northern Italy, records show that a brother named Silvano brewed a tea with crushed poppy and honey. He drank it at dusk, knelt in prayer, and spoke no more for 3 days. When he awoke, he claimed he had visited a tower made of glass, where angels wept and time was still. He wept too, not out of fear, but because he said he missed it. There was no punishment, only silence. Herbs weren't always taken to see beauty. Sometimes they were taken to escape ugliness. In villages where hunger gnawed and illness bloomed like mold, plants were a last hope. A dried root under the tongue, a bitter syrup before sleep. Not all were as famous as mandrake or poppy. Some were just local secrets. Henbane, with its yellow flowers, brought visions of flying. Datura, with its trumpet-shaped blooms, could spin the stars and fold time. Monkshood, also called wolf's bane, could numb a body until it forgot it was dying. Wise women and midwives knew the recipes. So did some traveling healers. A pinch of this, a simmer of that, and you could fall into a dream that outlasted night. You might wake remembering nothing, or everything. There were consequences. Some never woke at all. Others woke changed. People told stories of those who drank from a cup and lost their names, who returned home but no longer recognized the door. They weren't feared. They were pitied. Some believed they had seen too much, that their minds, cracked open by the brew, had glimpsed something forbidden. And there were those who chased it. Not all who took the herbs did so by accident or need. Some sought the high like a pilgrimage. They whispered to each other in markets, traded bundles of dried stems wrapped in cloth, shared secrets in exchange for coins or favors. They weren't criminals, just people who wanted to leave, if not in body, then in thought. In the winter months, when days were short and cold pressed in from all sides, it became more common. Fires dimmed, hope thinned, and a cup of strange tea became the only door that would open. What they found behind that door was not always light. Some saw monsters. Some saw the dead. Some wept through the entire night, unable to explain what they felt. But they returned to it, again and again, because the world, even at its best, was heavy, and the herbs made it float. Not everyone who used herbs wanted to fly or dream or see angels. Some just wanted the pain to stop. Pain was a constant companion in the medieval world. It came with rotting teeth, shattered bones, torn flesh, childbirth, starvation, infection. There was no morphine, no anesthesia, no gentle drip to quiet the nerves. There was only what you could grow, what you could boil, what you could drink. And for that, plants answered. A peasant might chew a leaf while digging graves. A blacksmith might keep a hidden flask for the nights his hands shook too hard to eat. A midwife might press a spoon of tincture to a mother's lips as she screamed in labor. They weren't getting high to escape life. They were doing it to endure it. But sometimes that endurance came with visions. There's a record from a village in southern Wales where an entire family fell ill after eating a stew seasoned with seeds thought to be coriander. They weren't. They were stramonium, a member of the nightshade family. The children laughed and screamed in turns. The mother wept because she saw her dead father standing in the firelight. The father sat outside, staring at the sky, claiming he could hear the moon whisper. They all survived. Barely. Afterward, The villagers whispered about witches, but the healer who visited said it plainly. The seeds were cursed. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant they held power humans shouldn't play with. Still, many did. There were those who came to love the edge, walking that line between numbness and knowing. They learned how to brew just enough to bring warmth to the chest, colors to the air, softness to the voice of the world. Too much, and it tipped into chaos. Too little, and nothing changed. But if the dose was right, just right, it was like drifting into the place between sleep and memory. One old woman in a Flemish village was known for her teas. People came to her not for healing, but for what she called cloud water. A blend of dried petals, roots, and bark, brewed slowly in spring rain. Those who drank it claimed they remembered old dreams, faces they hadn't seen in years. Some said they heard music with no source. Others returned in silence and never spoke of it again. She was never accused of witchcraft. No one dared. They needed her too much. But there were places where such knowledge was dangerous. Inquisitors did not care for distinctions between healing and hallucination. If someone slipped too far into vision, if they spoke of things that frightened the village, too much fire, too many wings, too much truth, they could be marked, not as ill, as possessed. Trials mentioned dancing madness, laughter that would not stop, eyes that did not blink. The accused often had no idea what they had done. Many were ill, some were poisoned, a few had simply seen something they couldn't explain. But once the mind moved beyond the fence of normal thought, the body followed. And in the world of the medieval villager, the body mattered less than the soul. If your soul was seen as cracked, others feared the break might spread. So those who dabbled in hallucinogenic herbs learned to do so quietly. They dried their leaves in attics, boiled roots behind closed doors, whispered recipes into hungry ears. They shared what they could, when they could, and never told the same story twice. There was safety in secrecy, and there was power in the plants. The earth, in all its rot and bloom, gave humans something they couldn't find anywhere else: the ability to drift beyond themselves. Not every plant offered beauty, not every high brought peace, but even the darkness had its use. A man who saw monsters in the mist might find himself more grateful for daylight. A woman who watched her grief twist into gold in the firelight might feel lighter come morning. The herbs didn't fix life. They gave it edges. And sometimes those edges were sharp enough to remind you you were still alive. There are ways to escape the world that don't involve herbs or drink or prayer. Sometimes the body itself becomes the drug. Flesh, breath, heat. In the medieval world, pleasure was both feared and craved. And for some, it was the only way to feel something outside of pain. The church warned against it. Passion was dangerous. It led to sin, they said, to madness, to damnation. But no warning ever stopped the craving for touch or the hunger to lose oneself in another body. For many, the moments of closest contact, of sweat, of breathlessness, of surrender, offered something no priest could give: silence. Not the silence of discipline, but the silence that came when thought dissolved, when the mind dropped away and only sensation remained. They didn't use words like dopamine or endorphins. They didn't talk about chemicals. But they knew what pleasure did. They knew it made the heart race, the head light, the skin burn, and time vanish. They knew it made pain quieter. And in that vanishing, they found their escape. Among the poor, Sex was a rare moment of control. You couldn't decide the taxes or the harvest. You couldn't stop disease, but for a few minutes, behind a barn, in the dark, you could be something else. Not a servant, not a laborer, just heat and movement and breath. There are letters, ballads, and court records that hint at the ways people use the body to flee the mind. A man caught 3 times in the arms of a milkmaid, each time claiming he was bewitched. A woman fined for lying with laughter beside a monk who said she made him see God. The language is polite. The truth is not. In the cities, brothels were regulated by the crown. They were not hidden. They were painted red and kept near rivers. Sex was a service, a trade, a necessity. But sometimes it was more than that. Sometimes it was theater. Rooms were draped with colored cloth, perfumes burned, musicians played in corners, and those who entered did not come for love. They came for transformation, to be seen without judgment, to be touched without fear, to be someone else for just a little while. In some bathhouses, oils were mixed with herbs, valerian, lavender, even poppy, rubbed into the skin until heat spread, until limbs loosened, until the world melted. There are accounts of nobles who paid for nights spent in silence, lying naked beside strangers in warm water, listening only to breath and dripping steam. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The touch was enough. The warmth did the rest. Some religious orders called this the devil's whisper. They said pleasure opened doors that should stay shut. They weren't wrong. For many, the edge of orgasm felt like falling through the world. A moment where time fractured, the body vanished, and something strange arrived. Some called it God, others madness. It didn't matter. The high was real. In secret circles, lovers mixed wine with herbs before joining, not to dull the act, but to deepen it, to stretch it, to reach that moment of complete loss, when you no longer remembered your name, or your sins, or the winter waiting outside. And afterward, the quiet felt like holiness. Even in convents, stories bloom. Nuns who claimed ecstasy so intense they lost the use of their limbs, who wrote of heaven's touch on their thighs, who fainted in prayer and wept in sleep. Some were sainted, others were silenced. The line between sacred and sensual blurred. There are sculptures in stone cathedrals, curled into corners, hidden behind columns, that show mouths open, backs arched, eyes closed. Artists said they depicted the soul's yearning. But the body remembers what the soul forgets. Not all sought flesh for pleasure. Some sought it for escape. There were those who returned from war too broken to speak, who could only find breath again in the arms of someone who expected nothing. There were widows who let strangers hold them for warmth, or men who kissed each other in shadows, all of them trying, in their own way, to come back to themselves. Because sometimes, the body is the only map that leads home. And in the medieval world, where death was everywhere, to feel alive in your skin, even for a moment, was its own kind of miracle. For all the rules and walls and warnings, the body always found a way. Through silence, through ritual, through secrecy. Touch in the Middle Ages wasn't just a source of desire, it was a portal. When the weight of survival grew too heavy, people turned inward to sensation. They closed their eyes, not to shut out the world, but to enter another one where breath and skin and rhythm offered something no bishop, no brewer, no herb ever could, the illusion of freedom. That illusion was powerful. It wasn't just about sex, it was about surrender. Even in the church, those who lived in cloistered silence knew the tremble of the body. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote of being pierced by a divine arrow, her soul in ecstasy, her body unable to bear the sweetness. Her words trembled with more than piety. The burning, the weightlessness, the collapse, it mirrored not only prayer, but pleasure. She was canonized. Others weren't so lucky. In towns and villages, women who spoke of sensual dreams were often accused of being touched by demons. If a man confessed to dreaming of heaven while in bed with another, it was assumed the devil had a hand in it. Pleasure was not seen as healing. It was seen as suspicious. But for those who knew how to walk the line, who understood the body's secrets, a different kind of wisdom emerged. There were lovers who moved like dancers, slow and knowing, who spoke little, touched carefully, and left each other lighter than before. There were women who taught each other how to breathe through pain and into softness. Men who whispered not names, but stories during the act. Tales to carry the mind away, while the body followed. The church wrote laws, the people wrote poems, and the poems never apologized. In one Breton folktale, a widow describes her favorite night with her husband, not by what he said or did, but by how the room smelled, smoke and sweat and cider, and how she forgot her name when he kissed the back of her knee. That forgetting, she says, was her heaven. There were places known not for their buildings, but for their warmth. A cottage outside of Rouen where travelers stopped not for a bed, but for a touch that didn't hurt. A stone cellar in Prague where strangers met in silence, leaving coins behind, but never names. No brothel signs, no guilt. Just breath in the dark and a promise to vanish with the dawn. These stories weren't told openly, but they were passed down, from lips to ears, from hands to hands. Because even if the world was falling apart, even if the crops failed, even if the plague returned, there was still the body, still the curve of a neck, the press of palms, the hum of blood in a wrist. There was still the chance to disappear inside someone else, just for a moment. And what a moment it was. Long after the wars ended, long after the lords fell and the towers crumbled, these moments remained. Not in books, but in the way people touched each other in the dark, in the rituals of warmth, in the aching sweetness of being known, if only briefly. In a world of suffering, of superstition, of smoke and shadow, to get high through the flesh was not a sin. It was survival, and no doctrine could take that away. Pain was everywhere. It waited behind every corner, under every doorway, inside every wound that didn't heal. In the medieval world, to be alive was to suffer, sometimes quietly, sometimes with screams. There were no anesthetic masks, no numbing injections, no guarantees. Only prayers, steel and roots, pulled from dirt. When the surgeon arrived, people wept, not because they feared he'd fail, but because they knew he'd succeed, and that success would hurt. Legs were cut, teeth were pulled, boils were lanced, arrows dug from flesh with iron tools that hadn't been cleaned since the last unlucky soul. And yet, people endured, because they had no choice. But not all pain was faced alone. There were things to drink, things to chew, smoke to breathe, powders to scatter on the tongue and hope they did something. Some of the most feared tools in the healer's kit were not the knives, but the herbs. Mandrake again, henbane, wild lettuce. They didn't erase pain, but they blurred it. They made time fuzzy and sounds far away. They pulled the mind slightly out of the body so that what happened to the flesh felt like it was happening somewhere else. There is a written account of a woman whose leg was crushed beneath a wagon wheel. She was given a mixture of ground poppy and warmed ale. They cut her leg off. She screamed once, and then stopped. Her eyes remained open. Her breathing slowed. When it was done, she whispered, "I dreamed of wheat fields." She survived. But she never spoke again. Was it the drug, or the trauma, or both? Monastic healers knew how to brew sedatives. They didn't call them that. They called them drafts of quiet, or sleep waters, or prayer brews. Recipes varied by region, but many included combinations of valerian root, hemlock, opium, and sometimes even belladonna in tiny, trembling doses. The challenge was in the balance. Too little, and the pain remained sharp. Too much, and the patient never woke up. Surgeons knew this, and so did torturers. For as much as herbs were used to dull agony, they were also used to prolong it, to keep the victim awake, aware, unmoving. Some torturers in inquisitorial prisons were said to mix calming herbs with stimulants, just enough to keep the body still, but the mind alive. There were powders blown into faces to cause dizziness, smoke wafted beneath noses to rouse someone from fainting, only to drag them back under again. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about control. And the church, for all its sermons, had little mercy for those accused of sin. But not every drugged state was forced. There were those who submitted willingly, who drank the brew before surgery with gratitude, who begged for more when it ran out. Because sometimes, pain didn't come from wounds. It came from the weight of memory, of grief, of a life too full of days that felt the same. And in those cases, even the smallest vial of sleep tincture felt like hope. A man with a festering tooth might drink until he couldn't feel his jaw. A woman in labor might chew a leaf until her eyes glazed. A child burning with fever might be wrapped in blankets soaked in valerian and rose water, murmuring nonsense until the fever broke, or didn't. In these moments, the drug was not a luxury. It was a thread between life and death. And sometimes, it was neither. It was just a door to somewhere quieter. In certain monasteries, the boundary between healing and suffering was thin. Brothers who tended the sick often had to choose between watching someone writhe in pain or slipping them a potion that might stop the pain forever. And when your tools were boiled leaves and dried roots, precision was a dream. They guessed. They prayed. Sometimes both. But even when pain was unavoidable, people still clung to moments of mercy. A record from a convent in Flanders tells of a nun who prepared a thick paste made from mashed poppy seeds and goose fat. She applied it to the temples of the dying, not to cure them, only to soften the passage. She called it the fading ointment. Those who received it often smiled before going still. That smile, she said, was worth the risk. Elsewhere, more violent uses of herbal sedation took root. When nobles wanted confessions from enemies or rivals, they didn't always resort to the rack first. They sometimes chose concoctions, sleep herbs to lower resistance, followed by stimulants to jolt the truth out of tongues. A few of these recipes involved henbane tea followed by a bitter tincture of mustard seed and hot vinegar. The body went numb, then snapped back alive with shaking hands and a loose mouth. It didn't always work, but when it did, the words spilled out fast, and often broken. And then there were the stories of ecstasy and pain. Some believed that suffering itself brought visions, that a wound opened the spirit. Monks who whipped themselves into unconsciousness. Women who walked barefoot across stone until their feet bled. These weren't acts of madness, but of devotion. They believed the body had to be broken to let the soul climb out. In some cases, Herbs were added too. These rituals, not to stop the pain, but to intensify the trance. A blend of sage, vervain, and yarrow was sometimes brewed into a bitter tea and drunk before flagellation. Its sharpened sensation made the skin more aware. As blood ran, the mind soared. The line between agony and rapture blurred. These were not pleasures. They were pursuits, to touch something greater than the self, to feel the body disappear beneath the storm of nerve and heat and surrender. There are stories of anchorites, religious hermits, who cut themselves quietly and packed the wounds with herbs to prevent rot but not numbness. They believed the pain was a bridge, that the ache was the voice of God knocking from within. For some, it was madness. For others, it was the only thing that ever made sense. And then, in the secular world, there were those who found comfort in drugs, not for healing, not for escape, but because pain had become familiar. A soldier returned from battle might ask for the same draught that once dulled his arrow wounds, not because he was hurt again, but because the absence of pain felt too hollow. He drank it slowly, alone, waiting for that half-forgotten blur to wash over him. In those moments, pain and its echo became a kind of identity. The tools of relief, the herbs, the fumes, the oils, never fully separated from the pain they were meant to ease. They became part of it. They shaped it, sometimes soothed it, sometimes twisted it into something strange and bright. There was no handbook for dosage, no clean instruction, just memory and hope. One more pinch than last time, a longer boil, a softer voice while the cup touched the lips. And always, the uncertainty. Would the pain stop? Would the person? Would the dream be warm or endless? In a world that offered little mercy, even the smallest brew could feel like salvation. And sometimes, that salvation came wrapped in agony. Because to feel anything, pain or ecstasy, was better than feeling nothing at all. There were days in the medieval calendar when everything turned upside down. When beggars sat in thrones, priests danced through the streets in masks, and women led parades of drunken men through the market square. These weren't riots. They were planned, expected, blessed by tradition and feared all the same. They called them feasts, festivals, misrules. But they were more than celebration. They were release. In a world built on hierarchy, silence, and repetition, madness had to be allowed to breathe, if only for a day. And when it didn't come quietly. The Feast of Fools, the Festival of the Ass, Carnival, these were not polite affairs. They were eruptions, days when the village became its own hallucination, where colors replaced mud, music drowned out the coughs of winter, and wine flowed without question or judgment. But it wasn't just wine that changed people. These were the days when everything forbidden became permissible. Men wore dresses, women painted mustaches, children crowned each other kings. Laws bent, masks allowed people to say things they never dared in daylight. And underneath it all, there were whispers about herbs mixed into cakes, wines steeped in poppy, meats laced with strange powders. It was a festival, yes. But it was also a collective trance. Not everyone partook consciously. Some came to watch and left changed. A woman laughed for the first time in years and couldn't stop. A man danced until his feet bled and claimed he was chasing music no one else could hear. A group of farmers followed a painted goat through town until the sun rose, then collapsed in tears beside a fountain they didn't remember reaching. Were they drunk? Of course. But many weren't just intoxicated. They were altered, shifted. The festival was a doorway. The peasants knew this. So did the lords, and most surprisingly, so did the church. For all its rules, the church allowed certain festivals to continue on the condition that they ended, that the madness had a deadline, that by morning the masks would be gone, the wine cup smashed, the incense snuffed out. Because the madness wasn't the problem. It was the idea that it might stay. In some villages, these festivals lasted 3 days, in others, 7. There are records of communities where, once a year, the village would select a lord of misrule to oversee the chaos. This person could command anyone to dance, sing, strip, or kneel. Their word was law for as long as the madness held. There was a freedom in obeying someone you weren't supposed to, a thrill in surrendering to rules made only for breaking. And through it all, people drifted in and out of their bodies, laughing, crying, throwing flour into the air and chasing chickens through the streets. In one account from 1296, a bishop visiting a small French town described what he saw during such a festival. He wrote of nuns in red scarves, monks who sang like wolves, children pretending to be executioners. He called it blasphemy. But he also confessed that for a moment he forgot who he was. That forgetting was the point. People didn't want to become someone else forever. Just long enough to shake the weight of who they always had to be. Even the old took part. There are stories of grandmothers wearing crowns of hay, leading mock weddings between pigs and roosters. Of old men painted with ash, claiming to be prophets. Of villagers who pretended to die, only to rise again laughing, covered in feathers and shouting nonsense. It wasn't just fun. It was sacred nonsense. A ritual madness shared so no one had to carry it alone. And when the fires burned low and the drums stopped, they returned to their lives. But not unchanged, because even a single day of permitted chaos could echo for a year. Even one afternoon of being someone else could make being yourself just a little more bearable. When the festivals ended, not everyone returned the same. There were always a few who stayed behind in their minds, who kept laughing at things no one else could hear or weeping in corners long after the dancing stopped. The village made excuses. Too much drink, they'd say, or the devil found a crack. But deep down, everyone knew that madness wasn't always something you caught. It was something the festival allowed to show its face. The madness was already there. It just needed space. And sometimes, that space became too wide to close. Still, the people never stopped celebrating. They couldn't. The festivals were pressure valves in a world that never relaxed. You could work yourself to the bone for a lifetime, and no reward would come. But for one day, maybe 2, you could wear feathers, speak in riddles, and throw mud at your landlord without consequence. The nobility allowed it, sometimes even joined it, because they understood something too. Fear loses its sharpness when laughter is allowed. Chaos, when ritualized, becomes less dangerous. Let them scream once a year in masks, and they're less likely to scream the rest of the time without them. But even the lords weren't immune to the pull. There's a story of a young baron in northern Italy who disguised himself during carnival and entered a tavern full of peasants. He danced with the baker's wife, played dice with a stable boy, and got into a mock sword fight with a man missing 3 teeth. When it was over, he returned to his estate and never mentioned it again. Except, later that year, he lowered the rents. Sometimes, becoming someone else, even for a night, made it easier to be human again. There were other festivals too, Regional, strange, half-remembered. The goat's wedding, the day of the burning bread, the night of the spinning bells. Some were based on old pagan rites, others were just accidents of tradition. But they all carried the same energy: looseness, laughter, temporary madness. Some involved herb-laced wines passed in secret. Others relied on fasting, or noise, or overwhelming music to bring people to a frenzy. Children danced until they fell asleep. Adults followed fake saints through the streets, singing songs no one wrote down. In one German village, people wore masks carved from turnips and chanted nonsense words until dawn. No one knew why. They just did, because it made them feel something. And in a life ruled by hunger, obedience, and repetition, something was everything. The church tried sometimes to tame the wildness. Priests preached sermons the day before misrule began, warning against temptation, reminding villagers that their laughter must return to solemnity. And when the festival ended, they burned the effigies, washed the altars, and restored the silence. But the memory stayed, and so did the need. For those who had nothing else, the festivals were their only intoxication, not of the body, but of the soul. A dizziness of identity, a swirling, joyful uncertainty that reminded them they were more than just their work. Their roll, their fears. They were dreamers, if only for a day. When the masks came off and the work began again, they didn't forget what it felt like to be wild, to be ridiculous, to dance badly, sing loudly, love freely. And that memory was a kind of high all its own, a soft echo of freedom in the ear of obedience. The medieval world didn't use the word addiction. There was no Latin term for compulsion that drew you back to the same bottle, the same pipe, the same bitter root you swore you'd never touch again. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. They saw it. They just called it something else. A man who drank too much was said to be overcome. A woman who couldn't stop chewing the same leaves that made her smile and forget her name was touched by shadow. And those who fell too far into their own visions, who stopped speaking, stopped eating, stopped recognizing their children, were believed to be possessed. When the church encountered such people, the solution was not therapy or treatment. It was ritual. Exorcism was the first resort for many. If you trembled, cried out in foreign tongues, or shook without cause, it was assumed something had entered you. A demon, a spirit, a punishment. The cure was prayer, holy water, fasting. You were not healed. You were fought over. But for those who weren't dramatic in their suffering, for those who simply couldn't stop, there were other responses. Isolation was common. You were sent away, sometimes to a monastery, where silence might do what medicine could not. Sometimes to a far field, to live in a hut built by your own neighbors. There, you were to wait out your cravings, alone, cold, forgotten. Some came back, most did not. In rare cases, compassion appeared in strange forms. Certain monasteries kept what they called gardens of restraint. These weren't prisons. They were small enclosed areas with herbs meant to soothe the mind. Lavender, chamomile, sweet balm. Those who suffered from too much desire, too much dreaming, too much wine, were brought there to rest. They were not punished. They were watched. They drank bitter teas. They sat beneath the trees. And they were told to pray until the desire left them. There's one record from a Welsh abbey where a man returned 3 times to the same garden. Each time, he begged the monks to help him forget the taste of the poppy syrup he once drank after battle. He said he could still feel it blooming in his throat. On the 3rd visit, he left behind his sword, and never spoke again. Not all treatments were gentle. In some towns, those seen as dangerously addicted, usually to alcohol, were chained. Not cruelly, but firmly. A blacksmith might be asked to craft a simple collar and length of chain, bolted to a wall. The drinker would be given bread and water. No one came near until a priest said the demon was gone. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes they simply waited for the trembling to stop, then drank again. Women who were caught using herbs for pleasure were often sent to nunneries. There, they were not always shamed. Some were taken in with quiet understanding. The older sisters knew what loneliness could do. They gave them work, silence, and tea made from forgetful plants, not to erase the cravings, but to soften them. But not all addiction came from the desire to escape. Some came from necessity. Mothers who used herbal sleep aids to quiet starving children sometimes found themselves drinking the same brew long after the children had grown. It was the only thing that calmed the memories of crying in the dark. Men who once needed drink to survive a winter found they couldn't stop even when spring came. And no one knew what to do with them. There were no support groups, no clinics, no second chances from employers. There was only reputation, whispers, and isolation. But a few found sanctuary, not in buildings, but in people. A friend who sat beside them through the shaking, a midwife who replaced wine with warm milk laced with sage, a monk who brewed a different kind of tea, one that made the cravings quieter, not stronger. These were the quiet acts of medieval rehab, invisible to records, impossible to quantify, but real. Because even in a world obsessed with sin and punishment, someone, somewhere, knew that not all demons came from hell. Some were born of sorrow, and healing them required something gentler than fear. There were no words for recovery, no promises of progress or steps to follow. There was only the hope that one day the craving would lessen, that the shaking would slow, that sleep would come without the bottle, the pipe, the pedal on the tongue. But in rare corners of Europe, there were people who tried. In certain Benedictine monasteries, a handful of monks recorded treatments not for sin, but for compulsion. Their notes speak not of demons, but of restlessness, of dreams that do not end, of thirst that no drink can quench. They wrote about the ways wine twisted itself into memory, and how memory became a sickness that lived in the blood. They suggested fasting, yes, but also companionship. They believed that solitude could sometimes make the shadows louder. So they sat with the afflicted, quietly, through the night, through the storms, through the long silences when the person said nothing, not even their own name. They called it watching beside the broken. No prayers, just presence. Some healed, or at least learned how to live with the wound. Others simply vanished. They left the cloister and returned to the world. Changed or unchanged, no one ever knew. Among villagers, healing was more practical. If someone drank too much, their neighbors hid the casks. If someone ate the wrong root too often, the healer refused to brew. It wasn't science. It was community. The simple act of making it harder to disappear. There were stories of families who rotated nights, keeping watch over a son who couldn't stop shaking. Of women who sang to their sisters, holding their hands as the bitter sweat poured. Of children who learned which herbs smelled dangerous and refused to bring them home. And sometimes it was not herbs or drink that drew people in, but possession, or what they believed was possession. A girl who laughed too much, a boy who didn't sleep, a farmer who screamed in the fields every night at dusk. These were not seen as mental illness. They were spiritual battles. The church responded with ritual, salt at doorways, crosses drawn on the forehead, bells rung in the cold. Some were tied down during Mass. Others were forced to walk barefoot to the cathedral and confess sins they didn't understand. It helped sometimes, not because it cured them, but because it gave form to the formless. And in some cases, the afflicted believed they had been freed, that something had left them, that the trembling was over, and that belief, even if born of smoke and song, brought peace. But belief could also harm. There were those who died in exorcism, who suffocated in ritual, who fasted until their hearts failed, because the world around them feared what they could not control, and in their fear, they broke what was already fragile. Still, among the rubble of misunderstanding, compassion grew. A widow who fed broth to the silent man under the bridge. A shepherd who gave up his strongest wine for a neighbor trying to stop. A mother who never spoke of her daughter's sleep drafts, but always made sure the right herbs were gone from the garden. These were the real treatments, the unseen ones, the unrecorded ones. Not punishments, not chains, just a hand in the dark. A voice that said, "You can stay." There is no list of those who recovered, no ledgers of healed minds. But the stories survive in fragments. A grave marked with a carved poppy, a diary page with only one sentence. "Today I didn't drink." A piece of wood worn smooth by hands that held it during the long nights of shaking. In the end, the medieval world had no perfect answer for addiction. But it understood something modern minds forget. Sometimes, the only cure is not being alone. It's easy to look back with curiosity, to imagine sipping a medieval brew, chewing a wild root, joining in a festival, and floating into some ancient euphoria. The drawings look strange, but harmless. The stories feel distant, the danger far away. But the truth is colder, heavier, closer to the bone. You wouldn't survive it, not because you're weak, but because they weren't playing. The people of the Middle Ages didn't get high for fun. They got high because it was the only option left. And the substances they used didn't come with warning labels, dosage charts, or hotline numbers. They came from dirt, from whispers, from desperation. Imagine walking into a village where the air stinks of rot and smoke, where a child coughs until he vomits and no one looks twice. Your water isn't clean, your food is hard, your body aches, your mind screams, and the only relief is in a cup someone brewed in a rusted pot using roots they won't name. Would you drink? You probably would, just like they did. And then you'd feel it start. First, the warmth, then the spinning, then maybe a vision. A flicker of color behind your eyelids, or the sensation of someone breathing on the back of your neck when no one is there. Maybe it's pleasant, maybe it isn't. Maybe your heart starts pounding, your skin tingles. You forget where you are. You forget who you are. You try to stand and your legs don't work. You try to scream, but all that comes out is laughter. No one helps you, because to them, this is normal. They've seen it before. They saw it last week when old Tom chewed the wrong mushroom, when young Elsie drank too much of her grandmother's sleep milk, when the soldier came back from the war and kept sucking poppy water until his teeth fell out. They've seen what happens. They've seen people never come back. And you wouldn't know what to do. You don't know which herbs are safe. You don't know that what you're feeling isn't divine. It's toxic. You don't know that the warmth in your limbs is your blood slowing down, that the buzzing in your ears is your organs trying to keep up. And even if you did know, you couldn't stop it. because the moment you took that sip, that bite, that puff of whatever soot-stained miracle they offered, your fate was sealed. It didn't matter how modern your mind was, how strong your will. Their world wasn't built for you. Their tolerances were different, their dangers familiar. Their definitions of safe and sacred lived on opposite ends of a line you don't even see. And that's the real horror of it. Getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't recreation. It was roulette. Sometimes the villagers danced. Sometimes they saw angels. Sometimes they woke with bruises and stories. But sometimes they didn't wake at all. There's a grave in a northern English field marked with no name. Just a carved belladonna flower. Local legend says the woman buried there flew through the sky one night and never landed, that she was taken by spirits. In truth, she brewed the ointment too strong. No one knew how to bring her back. You think it's just folklore. But the herbs were real. The roots were real. The deaths were real. And the need behind it all, the aching need to step outside a brutal life, even just for a moment, that was the most real thing of all. For the people who lived through it, altered states weren't adventures. They were consequences. They were side effects. They were risks they took with full knowledge that something could go wrong, and often did. A healer might give you a root that calmed your fever or sent you howling into the night. A friend might offer you a tea brewed from flowers she didn't name. A priest might burn incense thick enough to choke a room while you knelt with your stomach empty and your mind wide open. And what happened next wasn't predictable. Some people returned laughing, others returned changed. A few never returned at all. They called it madness, possession, visions, miracles. But beneath every name was the same truth. The human mind can only carry so much pain before it spills into something stranger, something that looks like ecstasy or terror or both. And for many, the choice wasn't about pleasure. It was about not drowning in sorrow. They didn't have escape plans. They had ale, ointments, songs, rituals, the long, slow burn of plants pulled from soil they barely owned. They didn't seek enlightenment. They sought distance. Distance from hunger, from grief, from bodies that failed, from children who died, from lords who didn't care, from winters that never ended, from nights that came too early and mornings that never offered anything new. So they reached, and they took, and they tried. And the world spun. A miller's son who once chewed a piece of dream root to forget his father's death woke 3 days later in the woods, convinced he was a fox. He never spoke again, but he smiled whenever someone played the flute. A nun in Germany described a dream so vivid, so filled with light and wings and flame, that she refused to eat afterward, believing food would anchor her to earth. A soldier from Brittany drank something before battle and claimed he felt no fear, no pain, no time. He died with a smile. Their stories weren't rare. They just weren't recorded, not in the ledgers anyway, but in ballads, in warnings passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in symbols carved on door frames, in leaves tucked into pockets, in cups passed with a glance and a whisper. You wouldn't survive it because you'd think it was a story. They knew it was survival. And while we call it getting high, they didn't have a word for what they were chasing. It wasn't pleasure. It wasn't even relief. It was something older, more primal. The feeling of floating, of not being in the field, of not hearing the baby cry, of not feeling the sore tooth or the raw throat or the cold in the spine. The feeling of, just for 1 hour, not being in the body at all. We call it escape. They called it necessary. And if you were there, really there, you'd understand. You'd drink too. You'd smear the ointment. You'd walk barefoot to the church. You'd chew the root. You'd follow the music. You'd lie back and let the world blur, because the sharpness of their lives could not be dulled any other way. And no one, not even you, can stay sharp forever.